mission of the Dole Institute. Members of the SAB receive many great opportunities. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. We would like to encourage each of you to get special benefits and support the Dole Institute by becoming a friend of the Dole Institute. If you enjoyed this evening's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Hearing assistance is available, and we have a loop seating section at each program designated by a sign. If you have any questions about the loop, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers. Before we begin tonight, I would like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. And now, please welcome Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? I hear an echo. I'll say good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. Our director, Bill Lacey, is away this evening at a memorial service. I will say his wife's father passed away, and they're having his memorial. Before we begin tonight's Leadership and Globalization in Sports program, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our guest. Bob Kendrick has served as president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum since March of 2011. The Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is the world's only museum dedicated to preserving and celebrating the rich history of African American baseball and its profound impact on the social advancement of America. His involvement with the museum dates back to the 1990s, and he has served in various roles, including as a volunteer, director of marketing, and vice president of marketing. He has been responsible for the creation of several signature museum education programs and events, including the Legacy Awards and the Hall of Game.
Hall of Game.
Kendrick is widely regarded as one of the leading authorities on the topic of Negro Leagues baseball history and its connection to issues relating to sports, race, and diversity. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Bob Kendrick.
Thank you. And thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you. To start off, can you tell us a bit about your upbringing and your education?
Well, I grew up, as I was sharing with some of the folks over at dinner, I grew up in a small town in Georgia called Crawfordville, Georgia. Crawfordville is east of Atlanta, west of Augusta, all of about 500 people. According to my mother, every little girl that I wanted to date, oh boy, that's your cousin. So everybody knew everybody, and it was very difficult on your social life there in Crawfordville, Georgia. But it was I tell my kids today, I would not have changed it for the world. It was as unassuming, humble beginnings as anything. But I think it also makes you appreciate the small things in life, like indoor plumbing. yeah, like indoor plumbing. And so, which we did not have until I was about 12 years old. And so you have an appreciation for indoor plumbing and air conditioning and these kinds of things that a lot of other people might take for granted, but you also have a great appreciation for what was truly a very close-knit community. Everybody took care of everybody. And so I think it has helped shape and mold the person that I am. And hopefully as I continue to grow as a person, those roots will always play a part in who I am.
Tell us a little bit about your family.
Well, my Roger and Clara Pearl Kendrick was my mom and dad, and I am the youngest of 6. I'm the baby of 6 boys. And I always tell them, they say the best for last. Yeah, they say the best for last because I'm 10 years younger than the brother that I'm closest to. So there's no question I was an oops baby. And that's okay though, that's all right. You know, it doesn't matter how you get here as long as you get here. And I was, and so I'm the baby of 6 boys. And yeah, they were great parents. They I was telling some folks as we were backstage, they really sheltered me from the fact that we were poor. I had no idea that we were poor until I got to college, and then you realize, like, oh, wait a minute, y'all didn't tell me about this. But again, when you grow up in an environment like Crawfordville, when everybody had the same thing that you had, nothing. So you don't really realize what you don't have until you get to somewhere where somebody else has it. And so it was very humbling, but they were great parents. They were very nurturing. My mom and dad had 10th grade educations because that was all they could get in Georgia at that time. Mm-hmm. But yet they instilled the importance of an education into all of their children. And so that became a driving force for me. It became kind of that motivating force to say that there are opportunities beyond Crawfordville, Georgia. There are a lot of kids who ended up staying, and there's certainly nothing wrong with the fact that they stayed there, but I don't know if they had that vision of what could be, the possibilities of what could be there, the potential. And I think my mother and father always saw that potential in their children, and they wanted us to pursue that with all of our mind, our hearts, and our souls. And so it gave me that motivation, I think, to get out of Crawfordville. But those are still my roots. Buck O'Neill, the late great Buck O'Neill, would say that I was the only person he ever met from Georgia that didn't claim Atlanta as home. Yeah, because in Georgia, it doesn't matter where you're from. You could be 200 miles from Atlanta, and they'll still claim Atlanta as home. Well, I am not from Atlanta. I'm from Crawfordville, and I'm very proud of my Crawfordville roots.
And your mom and dad will be proud of you saying that. So would you tell us, what are some of the responsibilities you have as president of the Negro League Baseball Museum in Kansas City?
Well, I oversee the day-to-day operations of our museum. We have a staff of 8 full-time employees, about 4 part-time employees. So we're small for an organization our size because we are a national museum. As a matter of fact, Kansas City has 2 national museums, the National World War I Museum and the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And so we're very proud of that fact, and I get to oversee the day-to-day operations of it. I'm the principal chief fundraiser, chief marketing officer, pretty much all of those things that come along with it. And I get the job of getting out and really talking up this museum. So this is a welcome opportunity to get in front of folks and talk about what this great museum represents, not only to the city of Kansas City, but to our nation. And so it is as fulfilling and gratifying job as I've ever had. And I've been very blessed. I've had a number of jobs that I've really, really enjoyed doing. Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, though, is one that is a passion. And I think it has to be. In order to be successful in something like that, I can't sell it if I don't believe it. And I think it requires having that kind of passion, dedication, and commitment to it. And I do think for each of us who work there, that museum is a labor of love. Because any time that you do something that you know is bigger than you, I think that is as gratifying as it can get. Because we live in a world where it's about me, it's about self. And I think what we try to encourage our team there is to try and remove self from the equation. And we try and govern ourselves by one basic philosophy: what is in the best interest of that institution. But I think every one of us understands that if we do our job and we do it properly, we will leave something that will stand the test of time. And in essence, you leave a legacy. And it's rare that you get an opportunity to do that because we are so channeled and focused on what makes us, successful and rich and these kinds of things. And so none of us are ever going to be wealthy working at the Negro Leagues Museum, but it's a different kind of richness that comes along with it because my granddaughter will bring her children by historic 18th and Vine at some point in time and say, you know what, my grandfather had something to do with this museum. And that is certainly something that motivates.
Can you describe the design of the museum?
It's special. It's special. What we did was we created an old ballpark. And so when you walk into the museum, you literally come through the turnstiles and you've just entered an old ballpark. But in this ballpark, you're going to meet some new baseball heroes. Folks that we should have known about years ago. Many are just discovering. But even more so than the legendary baseball players, because I'll be honest, for us, it is almost a given that you're going to walk into the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and you're going to meet some of the greatest baseball players to ever put on a baseball uniform. But by the time you walk away from this experience, you walk away with what I believe to be an even greater appreciation for just how great this country really is. Because this story, it could have only happened in America. And so we treat it in that fashion, and so you walk into this old ballpark, and the first thing you see is the field of legends. And it is this mock baseball diamond that houses 10 of 12 life-size bronze sculptures of Negro League greats, and they're all cast in position as if they were playing a game. And the statues represent 10 of the first group of Negro League players to be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So that is how our all-star team was chosen. On the outside looking in, almost poetically, is my dear friend, the late great John Buck O'Neill, who is the only one of our collection of statues of players who is not in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And Buck is managing this great all-star team that we assemble. And so everything flows around this baseball diamond. And so as you are making your journey through the museum, you can see the field, but you can't get to it. We segregate you from the field because we wanted, and particularly our young audience, we wanted them to understand what segregation was like. So in the case of these great athletes, they knew full well that they were good enough to play in the major leagues. So close to it, yet so far from it. So from most vantage points in the museum, you can always see the field, but you can't get to it until you learn their story. And then after you've kind of got an understanding of what they had to endure just to play baseball in this country, then the very last thing that happens is now you can take the field. And it's that triumphant feeling when you take the field. Because for us, it's like, okay, well, now you're worthy to walk out on the field with 10 of the baddest brothers to ever play this game. Yeah, they could play, and their contemporaries knew that they could play, but it was just the social conditions of our time and fear. But we tell the story on a timeline of American history. So you not only come and learn about the rise and subsequent fall of the Negro Leagues, but you literally witness the social rise of America simultaneously.
Can you give us a brief verbal tour of the museum?
Yeah, no, you walk in and one of the most striking things for me is when you make your way into the gallery. Well, first of all, we separate you from the field with a chicken wire barrier. And chicken wire is symbolic because in those stadiums that, in that era of segregation, that would allow African Americans in to watch a major league game, more times than not, we were separated from white fans with a chicken wire barrier. So we use a chicken wire backstop to separate all of our guests from the centerpiece of our exhibition. Well, as you make your way into the gallery, we were looking for an inspirational passage that would set the mood and tone for what you will experience when you make your way into the gallery. And we chose a very powerful verse taken from the Roman Catholic Bible, Ecclesiastes, that simply says, "My son, if you aspire to be a servant of the Lord, prepare yourself for testing, set a straight course and keep to it, and do not be dismayed in the face of adversity." That was Negro Leagues Baseball in a nutshell. You have to remember that these athletes loved the game of baseball so much that they were willing to endure whatever social adversity confronted them as they traveled the highways and byways of this country just to play baseball. Their passion for our sport would not only change our game, but it changed our country. And that's the first thing that you're introduced to, and then everything else flows on a timeline of American history. So everything above the timeline is baseball related. What is captured in the timeline and below it are what I like to refer to as historical reflections of things that were happening to African Americans at that particular juncture in our country's history. So really for our guests, it becomes an all-encompassing history lesson. You not only come there and witness the rise and subsequent fall of the Negro Leagues, you literally witness the social rise of America. And believe it or not, guys, That is simultaneously. Many of the great changes that occurred in our society occurred as a result of Jackie Robinson's breaking of baseball's six-decade-long self-imposed color barrier. Well, very few folks, believe it or not, knew that Jackie Robinson's illustrious baseball career, pro baseball career, began in Kansas City with the great Kansas City Monarchs. And Jackie would leave the Monarchs to then go on and become the chosen one. But I think, Bill, people think Jackie just walked out of nowhere and started playing baseball. But his real professional roots began in Kansas City in 1945. And so there's a beautiful painting. We were talking about the great Kadir Nelson, the great artist Kadir Nelson, a little bit earlier. There's a beautiful Kadir Nelson painting of Jackie Robinson, and it shows him stealing home. And the piece is called Safe at Home. And Kadir Nelson, if you're not familiar, is one of the most amazing young artists in the country who just happened to take a likening to painting Negro League pieces. He paints all these other prolific works of art, but he fell in love with the Negro Leagues, like most of us did, when he saw Buck O'Neill on Ken Burns' epic documentary, Baseball. Yeah, and he started painting these amazing scenes relative to baseball. And then you meet Rube Foster, and then you stop at the street hotel, and you had to stop at the street hotel because Street Hotel was the black-owned hotel right down on the corner of 18th and Paseo in the historic 18th and Vine Jazz District. And as I tell our guests, it wasn't a travesty to have to stay at the Street Hotel because you were black and visited Kansas City. That's really where you stayed, or you got a room at the Paseo YMCA. But because of segregation, it created this explosive entertainment environment known as 18th and Vine. And 18th and Vine, in its heyday, was as recognized street cross-section as there was anywhere in the world because you had that intrinsic mixture of jazz and baseball radiating from that one street corner. And so we've got what we call the sitting room. The fancy term now is the lobby, the hotel lobby, but back then it was the sitting room of the street hotel. And as I tell our guests, you could walk into the sitting room of the street hotel on any given day, and you might see sitting in one of those chairs, former heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis, or at that time the fastest man in the world, Jesse Owens, although Jesse Owens would never race Cool Papa Bell. The legendary Negro League speedster James Thomas Cool Papa Bell. Now, Jesse Owens would race horses around the bases, but never Cool Papa Bell. Yeah, and you might see the legendary jazz artist Cab Calloway, who had his own semi-pro black baseball team. Louis Armstrong had his own semi-pro black baseball team. Lionel Hampton was a devout Monarch fan. As a matter of fact, the late, great Buck O'Neill would put Hampton in a Monarch uniform, and he'd sit on the bench and serve as an honorary coach. There are images of the beautiful Lena Horne throwing out the first pitch at an all-star game. And so that's why it's no small wonder that there at the museums at 18th and Vine, you have these two unique slices of culture, the American Jazz Museum and the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, because the two art forms go hand in hand.
All right, now you give me a perfect segue. Tell me about the history going into the Negro Leagues.
Well, it's a tremendous history, because when you walk those streets coming into the Negro Leagues Museum, 18th and Vine, historic 18th and Vine, you are walking the exact same streets that some of those legendary stars that I just mentioned. So you're walking the same streets that Satchel Paige, Buck O'Neill, Josh Gibson, Cool Papa Bell, Lena Horne, Lionel Hampton, Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong, they all walk those same streets. So when we talk about authenticity, I'm not sure there's a more authentic experience that you can have than coming to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and the American Jazz Museum. It is as authentic piece of history as any in Kansas City. And I think sometimes it is underappreciated, because there were a lot of people who wanted us to move, or not even move, to build a museum in a different location. And certainly it would have likely been more beneficial from a business standpoint, because there was nothing at 18th and Vine when we built the Negro Leagues Museum there, but it was never self-serving for us. But no matter if we had gone to Kauffman Stadium, if we'd gone to Union Station, You can't take that history with you. You can't take that level of authenticity with you. And I think as more people understand that level, it resonates even more when they come in to experience this. And you stop to think about the things that Kansas City kind of lays its reputation on. Barbecue, jazz, baseball. All these things really originate at historic 18th and Vine. Yeah, barbecue and jazz, that's where it all started, you know, in Kansas City. And so the Negro Leagues were established right around the corner from where we operate. And the building still stands, the old Purcell YMCA. So from a historical standpoint, I don't know if it gets any better than when you make your way to historic 18th and Vine. And it was jumping, y'all. It was jumping. It was a cultural crossroads where jazz and baseball intersected. The late, great Buck O'Neill would say someone would come to Kansas City, got a relative here in Kansas City, and they hadn't seen in a while. He'd tell them, just go stand on the corner of 18th and Vine. They got to walk by there. That's the kind of richness that was there. It was, again, I think, as recognized street cross-section as there was anywhere in the world.
Okay, so you had a newspaper that was covering a lot of this going on. Tell me about the Kansas City Call.
Kansas City Call still publishes a weekly paper. The black-owned paper, been publishing a weekly paper for many, many years. And like the other prominent black papers, the Chicago Defender, the Amsterdam News, the Pittsburgh Courier. The Pittsburgh Courier would have been like USA Today. It was a paper based out of Pittsburgh, but it was a national paper, the Kansas City Call, which still publishes every Friday a weekly paper that is targeted to the African-American community. They were the primary voices of the Negro Leagues. Truth of the matter is, had it not been for the black press, we would know very little about this history of the Negro League, because the mainstream papers would here and there cover, but not really. And so the black press became very influential in shaping and telling this story. We just recently opened a new theater at the museum called the Press Box Theater, and it is a celebration of the black press, which they were both instrumental in pushing for the formation of the Negro Leagues to give black baseball an organized body, and then ultimately pushing for the integration of the game of baseball. Great black writers like Sam Lacey, Wendell Smith, Bill Nunn. These men were, number one, they were staging tryouts for black players. They were the voice of trying to push for these men to get an opportunity to play in the major leagues. And so the new theater celebrates that piece of the history. But the caveat about the theater, the centerpiece is a short film about a guy named Lester Rodney. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the name Lester Rodney was a white communist journalist who is as influential in terms of pushing the integration of the game of baseball as anyone. And the film is called The Crime of the Big Leagues. And Lester Rodney was a thorn in baseball's side because he was writing about the likes of Monty Irvin and Larry Doby and these other great black stars, and pushing for baseball to break this ridiculous color barrier that they had in place, and he kept after it. And you have to remember that the Communist Party, he was working for a communist newspaper called the Daily Worker. And of course, obviously, communism was different than what we think about the Soviet Union or something of that nature. The Communist Party was very influential and was constant in its stance about social injustice and equality for all citizens. And so they were pushing this agenda, and baseball was a wonderful platform for them to push that agenda. And so the centerpiece of that new theater that's dedicated to the black press is about a white man who was a communist journalist. I tell people all the time, you can't make this stuff up. You can't make it up.
So what was the importance of the Negro Baseball League to the African-American culture?
Oh, yeah. Well,
and while you're at that, get into the economic aspect of it and everything else. We think of it as racism and a combination, but what about the economic, and what did that create?
Well, number one, it was a tremendous source of pride in the African-American community, because I think one of the things that kind of is a pet peeve of mine, so to speak, and I know that people mean well, and they'll come to me and say, man, it's a shame that nobody saw them play. Well, no, there were a lot of somebodies that saw them play. The moral majority of them just happened to be black. But they were filling up Yankee Stadium. They were filling up Comiskey Park. They were filling up ballparks all over the country. And wherever you had successful black baseball, you had thriving black economies. Yeah, mainstream America missed some of the greatest baseball players to ever play this game. But there are a lot of people who saw them. And Negro Leagues Baseball was an economic engine in the African-American community. It was the third largest black-owned business in this country. As the late, great Buck O'Neill said, it only trailed black-owned insurance companies who emerged during that era of American segregation, and they would insure me the white insurance companies would insure me just enough to bury me, 10 or 15 cent policy. Well, black-owned insurance companies came about and not only insured my livelihood, but insured my stock, insured my crop, insured my home, and as a result made millions of dollars. Next, of course, was Madam C.J. Walker, who would become this country's first self-made businesswoman millionaire of any skin color. Doing black hair.
Doing black hair.
Doing black hair.
Madam C.J. Walker. My mom told us all about Madam C.J. Walker.
Yeah,
You know,
C.J. had schools of cosmetology in every major urban center in this country, becoming the first woman to earn $1 million with a business structure. Next was Negro Leagues Baseball. And if old Buck was here, he'd tell you all you needed was a bus, 2 sets of uniforms, and you'd have 20 of the greatest athletes who ever lived. They could play. And their contemporaries knew that they could play. And so I'm not sure that the African-American community really realized what it was losing when we lost the Negro Leagues. Because again, wherever you had the successful black baseball, you had thriving black economies. And there's no question that Robinson's breaking of the color barrier spawned integration in our society. And then with integration, those smaller black-owned businesses could no longer compete. And so they perished, and with them, many of those communities like 18th and Vine, which brings us back to the Negro Leagues trying to help restore what used to be a very prominent African-American community. And we're trying to bring it back to that prominency once again.
Now, we talked about baseball and the players.
Yeah.
Give me 3 of what, and there's a lot more than 3.
Ooh, Lord.
And I knew them, and I went back yesterday and I read them again to make sure. But give us 3 that you think are like the top-notch ones that we should really know about and realize that they could have played with any baseball player in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
They could have held their own.
Oh, no, they would have more than held their own. Bill and I were just joking when we met here earlier, and I keep referring to Bill, but the great Bill James, who's with us tonight. Joe Pasnatsky, my good friend, great writer, now works for MLB.com, and last week he and I were on the phone together to put together a Negro Leagues player draft. This hypothetical, what if kind of thing, and didn't matter what era the players played in. We're just going to throw them all in a hat, and we're going to draft the creme de la creme to start our team. But I think if we were going to reduce it to 3, which is just an almost impossible task, the 3 guys...
All right, you can have 5.
Okay. I think the guys that automatically come to mind are the household names from the Negro Leagues. You have to start with Satchel Paige, and it's debatable whether or not he was the greatest pitcher to ever play this game. In Satchel's mind, he was the greatest pitcher, he was the greatest fisherman, he was the greatest hunter, so yeah, Satchel was just great. And in many ways, he was the Negro Leagues. Yeah, and Satchel Paige, number one, the mystery of how old he really was. We don't know. We don't know how old he was. Major League Baseball says he was 42 years old when he finally got his opportunity to play with the Cleveland Indians in 1948. Cleveland, you may recall, would win the World Series. As a matter of fact, last time Cleveland won the World Series was 1948 with the great Satchel Paige, Larry Doby, and that wonderful pitching staff that they had in 1948. Yeah. And Satchel, many thought that Satchel should have been named Rookie of the Year. Satchel goes 6-1 with a 2.4 ERA his rookie season at age 42, which means he was likely closer to 52. He never told his real age, and quite frankly, I don't think he knew his real age, which is certainly not far-fetched, because there were so many who were born in the Deep South who did not know how old they were. And like everybody else, Satchel's born in Mobile, Alabama. If I was guessing, I would say the early 1890s to mid-1890s. And he's born at home to a midwife. And, of course, that birth record was kept where? Who said that? In the Bible. Back page, I got some stuff here if I can reach it. The back page of the family Bible. And according to Satchel, according to Satchel, the goat ate that page out the Bible. So, so he didn't really know how old he was, but he was incredible because by the time, whether you believe he was 42 or 52, what he was able to do at the major league level is really unprecedented. And particularly for a guy who was a power pitcher. You know, you had guys like a Jamie Moyer who stayed a long time. Jamie Moyer was a jump ball pitcher. Satchel was one of the premier power pitchers of that era. You know, back then they had old crude radar tracking device the military did, clocked his fastball at 105 miles per hour. And old Buck says Satchel retires aside, kid from the military was there timing him and walks off the field, and kid says, well, Mr. Page, we clock your fastball at 105 miles per hour. Satchel looks at him and says, son, I wish I'd known you were timing me. I could have thrown harder than that. and then you've got to talk about the likes of Cool Papa Bell. You know, James Thomas Cool Papa Bell, as I said earlier, I think the greatest nickname in baseball history. Cool Papa Bell is still widely believed to be the fastest man to ever play this game. They clocked him circling the bases from home to home in 12 seconds. And his good friend, you may have heard the story, his good friend Satchel Paige said that Cool was so fast that he could walk in the room, turn off the lights, get in bed, pull up the covers before the room went dark. And actually, that is a true story. It really is a true story. Cool and Satchel were teammates on the great 1935 Pittsburgh Crawfords, widely regarded as one of the greatest baseball teams ever assembled. The 35 Pittsburgh Crawfords had 5 future Hall of Famers playing in their prime at the same time. So they had Satchel, they had Cool Papa, they had Judy Johnson, they had Oscar Charleston, and they had a young Josh Gibson. Yeah, all playing on the same team in 35. And on this particular instance, as the story has it, Cool and Satchel were teammates, but they were roommates when they traveled. And so Cool gets to the hotel room before Satchel does. He walks in the room, he turns the light switch on. There's a delay before the light comes on. He flips the light switch off. There's a delay before the light goes off. Old Cool says, uh-huh. When Satchel gets to the room, Cool is waiting on him. Satchel gets in bed, Cool gets up. Rooney, I'm so fast, I can flip this light switch off, run over, hop in bed, cover up before the room gets dark. And Satchel's like, Cool, you fast, but you ain't that fast. And so Cool Papa Bell bet his meal money. And Satchel took the bait. And in one of the great sports pranks of all time, because that light had a shortage in it, Cool was able to flip that light switch off, run over, hop in bed, cover up before the room went completely dark. Satchel was so outdone that he just always told folks that Cool was that fast. But Cool Papa Bell once stole 175 bases in a less than 200-game season. He twice, honest to God's truth, twice scored from first base on a bunt in exhibition games against Major League All-Stars. Yeah, one of the bunts was laid down by the great Satchel Paige. And I can tell you now, anytime Satchel did anything with the bat, it was a celebration. He wasn't a great hitter like a lot of the pitchers were in the Negro Leagues, but he laid that bunt down, and see, plays like the bunt and run, hit and run really were perfected in the Negro Leagues. And Cool is breaking with the pitch, and the pitcher gets caught not thinking that someone would try to score from first base, fails to cover the home plate. Cool beats him to the plate easily. And yeah, it happened twice against Major League All-Stars, but he could really, really run. He could run with the best of them. And I think Buck says the thing that separated Cool from the other fast guys, a lot of fast guys that played this game, both in the Negro Leagues and the Major Leagues, but he said it was Cool's incredible, almost uncanny ability to cut the bag. and he's on the inside. And the other guy's got to take that big rounding turn. And Buck would say that Cool would be so low to the ground that he could literally smack the bag with his hand and not fall over. That's God given. Yeah, that's God given. He was a left-handed hitter, so he's coming out the box running. And so, but the speed was legendary. Yeah, and then, of course, you got to talk about Josh Gibson. Josh Gibson, who many would call the Black Babe Ruth. But there were others who saw Gibson play who would call Ruth the white Josh Gibson. Yeah, Gibson was incredible. His power is almost mythic-like in nature. Yeah, because, you know, they don't measure places in the stadium that Gibson hit balls. They measure landmarks. They say, you see that tree over there? Josh hit one over there. You see the warehouse over there? Josh hit one over there. See those train tracks? Josh hit one over there. It was incredible, but as great a power hitter as he was, still believed to be the only man to hit a ball out of Yankee Stadium, he hit one in the Polo Grounds that they estimated to travel over 600 feet. And as I tell our guests when they come to visit the museum, his steroids, ham hocks, and collard greens. Yeah, the man, as we say from Georgia, was just country strong. But as great a power hitter as he was, I think it gets lost that Josh was a great hitter. A lifetime batting average of .354, and in head-to-head competition against major leaguers in exhibition games, hit over .420. And what makes it even more remarkable for those of us who are fans of the game, he was doing it as a catcher. Yeah, catchers don't do that. No, you get one or the other, power or average, but rarely do you get that combination of the two because the position's so physically demanding, it beats your body up. Well, Josh wasn't a good catcher. He was a great catcher. Rifle arm, throwing guys out from the crouch. Back in that era, Bucks had complete control of his pitching staff. Good running catcher. Going to steal your 20, 25 bases to go with that big bat of his. And when I say big bat, I mean big bat. 40 ounces. 40 ounce, 41 inches. You got to be a man to do that. Yeah, you got to be a man to do that. One of his bats is up for auction right now. And this was just after he had joined the Homestead Grays, so about 1931. He joined the Grays in 31, so this is when he was with the Crawfords in 35. So he's only about 21, 22 years old. This bat was a 38-ounce bat then. Yeah, he was just growing into his power. Yeah, he graduated to 40 ounces. And as anybody understands today, I don't know what they swing now, 33, 34, 35, probably at the heaviest today. And Gibson was swinging 40 ounces. Yeah, big, strong, powerful guy. But Buck would characterize him by saying that he had the eyes of Ted Williams and the power of Babe Ruth rolled into one incredible package.
Well, I'm going to ask two more questions, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Can you tell us about Buck O'Neil and his legacy in Kansas City? Ooh. But before you do that, it's around him. You made the point of what's on the field, and the only one not in the Hall of Fame
is Buck.
Now, I know it got to be a political thing because I was reading it and watching it. But why wasn't he inducted into the Hall of Fame?
You know, I don't know if we will ever know the answer because, obviously, I think the Hall of Fame really wanted Buck in. And they put together a committee of Negro League historians, educators, researchers who I respect tremendously. But, you know, I say sometimes you can get 12 really smart people together and they do something really dumb. They do something really dumb. Because what they did was they put 17 dead folks into the Hall of Fame. The two people who were still alive, Buck O'Neil and the late, great Minnie Minoso, they leave them out. Those are the two that would have brought this celebration to life. Because you can't have a celebration with dead folks. You just can't. And I understand what the committee was doing if they were looking at it from a purely statistical standpoint, but even those statistical data is so difficult to quantify, you know. But anyway, just a week ago was the 12th anniversary of Buck not getting in the Hall of Fame. And February 27, 2006 is a day in infamy for me because it was the most disappointing day for me personally and professionally. And Buck O'Neill and I left home that morning with suitcases packed, with airline tickets that the Hall of Fame had purchased for us. That's how sure we were that he was getting in. And we knew that this was a formality kind of thing because the committee had gathered down in Tampa, Florida, that was going to decide the fate of 39 Negro Leaguers on this final ballot. Buck and Minnie, as I mentioned, were the only two that were still alive. And so we got to the museum that morning, and at that time I was the director of marketing for the museum, and so I had brokered a deal with Sprint. Still one of our partners today. And so Buck has his Sprint phone. I got my Sprint phone. We gonna take the Hall of Fame call on the Sprint phone, and Sprint's gonna pay us a bunch of money. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, if I had to say so myself, just brilliant. Well, something went dreadfully wrong that day because the call was supposed to come to me at 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock rolls around, I don't get a phone call. Finally, about noon, my colleague, Dr. Raymond Doswell, who was one of the 12 voting members down in Tampa, he calls me and says, Bob, this thing is looking tight. We just did straw vote, and Buck is coming up a vote shy. Well, Joe was in the conference room with Buck, and I pulled Joe out, and I say, Joe, I just got a call from Ray, and Ray says this thing is looking tight. And he's in disbelief. So finally I take it back. Former Commissioner Faye Vincent was there overseeing the committee, but he didn't have a vote. He reconvened the committee so that they could talk specifically about Buck O'Neill and Minnie Minoso. And then finally, about 2 o'clock, I get a call from Jeff Idelson, who was then the vice president of marketing of the Baseball Hall of Fame. He is now the president of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and doing a wonderful job there in Cooperstown. And Jeff calls me and he says, Bob, Buck didn't get enough votes. And folks, I felt like someone had kicked me in my gut because now I got to go into this little conference room. You know, the same room that you did the interview, I got to go into this little conference room and I got to tell my friend that he didn't get enough votes to get in when I know in his heart he thought he was in. Why wouldn't he? And so I go in the room, I excuse a few folks, and my good friend Joe Pasnansky is sitting on one side of the table. Buck is seated at the head of the table. I go to the opposite side and I sit down and I'm trying to collect myself because I don't know what to say. And I finally say, Buck, we didn't get enough votes. And he looks up at me and he smiles. He says, well, that's how the cookie crumbles. And then in the next voice, he asked me how many had gotten in. I said 17. Now, I'll be quite honest. I was furious because in my mind, you couldn't put 17 in and leave Buck out when there was no limit on the number of people that you could put in. And so he hits the table in utter jubilation. He is excited that 17 of his colleagues had gotten their place in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. He asked me who they were. And I didn't have that information at that point in time. And then the next words that came out of his mouth was, I wonder if the Hall of Fame will invite me to speak. Now, Joe had turned beet red. He is furious. He looks at Buck and he says, Buck, you wouldn't do that, would you? Buck says, Joe, of course I would. What has my life been about? And so I said, well, Buck, I need to go downstairs to the Field of Legends. We had some 300 plus people, media and fans, who had gathered for what we all thought was going to be a Hall of Fame celebration announcement. I said, well, Buck, I need to go downstairs. I need to deliver the news, and then I will come back and get you so that you can say something, address the group. We'll let everybody go home. It's been a long day. Well, from our upstairs conference room to the Field of Legends was the longest walk of my life. I am literally trying to coach myself, Bob, you can't cry. Whatever you do, you can't cry. This is your job. You got to suck it up. The more I'm telling myself not to cry, tears are steady building in my eyes. I walk in, we had the podium at second base, and this is the honest to God's truth. I have never gone back to watch the video. I have no idea what I said that day, but whatever it was, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Well, Buck comes down, he walks in through our gift shop, and the room erupts into this thunderous ovation, room-shaking ovation. And he walks up to the podium and, for lack of a better term, delivered one of the most amazing concession speeches that I'd ever heard. What he did that day was implore all of us not to be angry, not to be bitter, not to express any ill will toward anyone who had anything to do with the decision. He said, I had an opportunity, and in this great country of ours, that's all you could ever ask. They didn't think old Buck was good enough, then we've got to live with that. But if I'm a Hall of Famer in your eyes, that's all that matters to me. Just keep on loving old Buck. Now I'm over in the corner. I am just a wreck by this time. I'm crying uncontrollably. But as I tell the story, in particular to the young people that I get an opportunity to meet virtually every day at the museum, and I share that story with them, what Buck did that day was he literally wrapped out his arms and wrapped them around all of us and said, it's okay. Yeah, instead of us consoling him, he's consoling us in what I still believe to be one of the most amazing displays of strength of character that I ever witnessed. He would push aside his disappointment, go to Cooperstown, deliver this incredible speech on behalf of 17 folks who didn't have a voice. Yeah, he was their voice. When the world was saying it should have been your induction speech, he's speaking on behalf of those who didn't have a voice, which I still say today was one of the most selfless acts in American sports history. A little over 2 months later, he passed away himself at age 94, a month shy of his 95th birthday. And I tell people all the time, what Buck O'Neil taught us that day was a tremendously valuable lesson on how to handle disappointment. Yeah, people always ask, because he handled it so graciously, that people thought he wasn't disappointed. Of course he was. The Hall of Fame represents the pinnacle for any athlete. And I think old Buck knew that he was sick at that time. And so he knew that this was going to be his swan song, but it was going to be, more importantly, the thing that would propel his museum into perpetuity. He wanted it for the museum more than he wanted it for us. But he was never going to be sullen about those who had gotten their place in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. But you know what? Buck knew that he did not need the Hall of Fame to validate him. He was a very self-assured guy. You know, and then for me, I had to remember that not getting in the Hall of Fame pales in comparison to some of the things that this man had to endure in his lifetime. And so he understood that, and so he was very gracious in defeat, and he was genuinely happy for those who had gotten in. It was one of the most remarkable things that I ever witnessed in my life. And as disappointing as it was to be there that day, it may have been the most inspirational thing that I ever witnessed, and I'm so glad that I was there to witness it, because it helps me every day in my own life when you go through these challenges.
It's helped me. I'm so glad you answered that. I will not ask another question. I think it is a perfect place to stop when you talk about Buck O'Neil and what he stood for.
Yeah. Well,
and you did justice to telling that story.
Well, the grandson of a slave. He's the grandson of a slave who helped impart change, who then lived long enough to enjoy that change. And he never stopped believing in what this country was and what it could be. And I think it is that spirit that, because most of us who fell in love with Buck, we didn't see him play. We never saw him play. We fell in love with the Buck O'Neil who told us about the heroes of the Negro Leagues. And we fell in love with the Buck O'Neil who so beautifully demonstrated to all of us that you can indeed get further in life with love than you can with hate. Yeah, that's the Buck that we fell in love with. And so in some ways, this was almost a fitting conclusion, because throughout this man's wonderful life, he seemed to always bring joy out of despair. And when he didn't get in the Hall of Fame, number one, he didn't have to fight for himself, because the rest of the world was fighting for Buck O'Neil. And Buck O'Neil died knowing that he was truly loved. Yeah, a lot of times we leave this earth and we always wondering whether people loved us or not. Well, not Buck. He knew that he was indeed loved And so he didn't have to fight this battle. He had a lot of other people fighting the battle for him. And I do tip my hat to the Hall of Fame because they got a lot of, I guess, a lot of abuse for what happened when they really didn't have anything to do with it. And they subsequently came back and created the Buck O'Neil Lifetime Achievement Award, and they erected a life-size statue of Buck. He's the only player in the Hall of Fame, inside the Hall of Fame, that has a life-size statue. There's old Buck to greet you when you walk in there. And every 3 years, they give the Buck O'Neil Lifetime Achievement Award. And guess what? You will always talk about Buck O'Neil as long as the Hall of Fame is giving that award. And when you talk about Buck O'Neil, you have to talk about his museum. It may have been the best thing that could have happened. Even though we all wanted to high-five and chest bump and hug with Buck because we wanted our guy to get in because we all felt he deserved to be in there. But again, bringing that joy out of despair, that was Buck O'Neil.
All right. Open up for questions.
I moved to Lawrence after 9 years enjoying the Washington Nationals.
Yes.
And we're a little trepidatious this year without Dusty Baker. Wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether the new battleground is for black and minority managers and coaches in Major League Baseball.
Well, you know, that was the side that has been a lot slower to occur. When Jackie integrates the game, it was really primarily the players who moved into the major leagues. You think about it. Buck O'Neil becomes baseball's first African-American coach in 1962 with the Chicago Cubs, 15 years after Jackie breaks the color barrier. You don't get your first manager until Frank Robinson in the mid-'70s. Your first GM also in the '70s with Bill Lucas. And so that hierarchy in the world of baseball was never quite fulfilled when the Negro League, when we lost the Negro Leagues. And I remember Buck so beautifully talking about the fact that when he became the first black coach in Major Leagues in 1962, how he was proud. But as he would say, I can't stick out my chest being the first black in this role when I knew all of this great talent who was more than capable of waving a guy home. And so that fulfillment didn't really occur with the integration of the game, and it's been much slower to come to fruition. So you only had a handful of guys who've gotten that opportunity to lead as managers, to be executives in baseball. And I think baseball understands that this is something, too, that has to be addressed as well. And so we remain very optimistic. And I say that with the understanding that baseball is the most diverse of all of our major sports. Yeah, it is as diverse as any, because you got players who represent the globe playing in this game. But American-born blacks have kind of started to phase out of this game. But I know that the work that we're doing in Kansas City, the building of these urban youth baseball academies, will not only hopefully continuing to get players onto the field, but looking at the hierarchy of our sport and developing those who can then function as managers and as coaches and as executives of teams. And so that still remains part of our hope. And when people walk in and they're introduced to guys like Rube Foster. Rube Foster is one of the most brilliant baseball minds this sport has ever seen, and nobody knows anything about him, even though he is rightfully in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. He was so far ahead of his time. Rube Foster formed the Negro Leagues in Kansas City in 1920. And Rube Foster had been a great player himself, great pitcher in the early era of black baseball, but best known as this visionary, this tremendous leader. And Rube Foster was an astute baseball mind. And not only did he create the Negro Leagues, but he was a great manager for the Chicago American Giants. And as a manager, Rube Foster was known to fine his ball players as much as $5 in the 1900s if they were tagged out standing up. You were supposed to slide. Yeah, Rube would draw a circle down the first base line and a circle down the third base line, and if every one of his players couldn't drop a bunt inside that circle, he would fine them. Yeah, Rube was adamant about that style of play that became signature of Negro Leagues baseball. But there were so many others who were brilliant baseball minds that didn't get that chance to transition when Jackie breaks the color barrier. A few guys got to be scouts, but very few of them got a chance to go on beyond being a scout at the major league level. So we remain hopeful that we can reverse that trend as well.
All right, other question?
Yes, can you tell me the story of how the Buck O'Neill seat
The legacy seat.
it
Yeah.
got to Royal Stadium?
Yeah. Well, you know, every now and then an idea comes along and you wish it was your idea. And 20, 25 years from now, I swear it was my idea. But it wasn't. It wasn't. It was the idea of Royals President Dan Glass. And it was absolutely brilliant. And the seat that she's referring to, Buck had his designated seat out at Kauffman Stadium. And even when he passed, he was still recognized as a scout, even though he really wasn't scouting anymore. He still charted pitches, though, in his seat there at the K, but he was really PR, so he was signing autographs, taking pictures, hugging, doing the things that we all knew and loved Buck for. And so when Buck passed away, the question was, what will the Royals do with his seat? And some wanted to memorialize it. Some wanted it to come to the museum to be on display there. And then Dan Glass came up with the brilliant idea of what now is called the Buck O'Neill Legacy Seat Program. And this program honors ordinary people who are doing extraordinary things to help other people. That's Buck O'Neill. That was the perfect way to perpetuate the legacy of Buck O'Neill. And for all 81 home games, someone sits in Buck's seat who embodies that giving spirit of Buck O'Neill. And what I love about the program is the community nominates someone. Yes, the community nominates. And so this is as selfless kind of act as any, but it's so important, and it was the absolute best way to remember old Buck. And they instituted the Buck O'Neill Legacy Seat Program in 2007. And do you know no one has missed sitting in old Buck's seat since they started the program in 2007. People are very proud to sit in that seat. I got a chance to sit in the seat twice. And, you know, and I knew Buck, and I knew him intimately, but it was still a tremendous honor for me to sit in his seat. Yeah, it really was. Now, it drove the people crazy who were sitting behind me because the TV cameras kept coming wanting to talk to me, and they couldn't hardly watch the game, so I had to apologize a lot for all the attention that was brought my way because I was sitting in the seat. But everybody wants to sit in Buck's seat, and, you know, I commend the Royals and Dan Glass for what they did because even during the All-Star game, during both World Series, they honored someone to sit in Buck's seat that entire time. It was an amazing thing to do, and one of the best ways, I think, to remember
You have a
Buck.
question over here? Yes. We'll have one more.
Sir, were there any black radio stations in Kansas City at this time, and were the Monarchs games broadcast on the radio?
The Carter Broadcast Company was started right around the time that the Monarchs was kind of phasing out, and so they didn't cover their games. And so really it was the Kansas City Call. The Star did a little bit. I worked at the newspaper for the better part of 10 years. And as great as the Monarchs were, there wasn't a lot in the Star's archives relative to the Monarchs. And when we talk about the Kansas City Monarchs, we're talking not just one of the great franchises in black baseball history, but one of the greatest baseball franchises in baseball history. There are those who will say that the Kansas City Monarchs were the New York Yankees of the Negro Leagues, but there are others who will say that the New York Yankees were the Kansas City Monarchs of the major leagues. The Monarchs had one losing season in their almost 40-year existence in the Negro Leagues. They sent more players to the major leagues than any other Negro League franchise. They were a model organization. They were ran by a man named J.L. Wilkinson. Yeah, the only white man of the original 8 Negro League franchises. But as Buck would refer to Wilkie, that he was the first white man he ever met who had no prejudice. Yeah, Wilkie earned his living in black baseball. Had a team called the All Nations who kind of morphed into the Kansas City Monarchs. And Wilkie, who was from Algona, Iowa, yeah, little bitty Algona, Iowa, he didn't see color. He saw these great athletes. And again, he made his living in black baseball. So yeah, it's a shame that we didn't get that kind of coverage, But man, the people who went, but the thing about Wilkie, he had the Monarchs on the road a lot, so a lot of people saw the Kansas City Monarchs in small towns, in large cities. We recently, it's about 5 years ago, uncovered a set of letters that were written by the guy who was then the president of the Yankees. This is 1945, and he was writing to Mayor LaGuardia. And Mayor LaGuardia in New York was pushing this effort for integration in our game. And the president then of the Yankees writes this letter to LaGuardia, and it was written in a very racist kind of tone, but there was actually some real merit to some of the points that he was raising. Number one, if you sign these black players from the Negro Leagues, that you were indeed going to put the Negro Leagues out of business, but he certainly did not believe that the Negro League players had the faculties necessary to play in the major leagues. And I don't know when ball players became these Rhodes Scholars. I really don't. But that was the sentiment, was that black baseball players weren't smart enough to play with major leaguers, and so many of those guys from the Negro Leagues were college educated men. Jackie Robinson went to Pasadena College, UCLA. He may have been the most intellectual being on the Brooklyn Dodgers team, and he's subjected to this harsh treatment. But anyway, he writes the letter to Mayor LaGuardia, and basically what he kind of outlines in the letter is that in 1945 alone, the New York Yankees made over $100,000 off the Kansas City Monarchs, because the Monarchs were renting Yankee Stadium and then go across the river to Newark, was renting Old Bears Stadium and Blues Stadium in Kansas City. Yeah, $100,000 off of the Kansas City Monarchs, one team. Were the Yankees in a hurry to see integration? Heck no. No, you're going to take away this source of income if you do. And so it's really, the dynamics of the story are so interesting. But yeah, it's a shame that you didn't have that same radio, so you don't have this audio history of many of those games. In Newark, you got a little bit of that in that part of the country, but not out here.
All right, let me ask the final question. Why did the league cease? When did they cease operations?
Well, we say that the leagues formally operated from 1920 until 1960, amazingly. 13 years after Jackie breaks the color barrier. But again, when we stop historically, it took Major League Baseball 12 years before every Major League team had at least one black baseball player. The Boston Red Sox would become the last team to integrate in 1959 when they signed a guy by the name of Elijah Pumpsie Green. Mr. Green is still alive, lives in the Bay Area. And so that would ultimately complete the integration cycle. By 1960, the Negro League ceased operations because by now, the best young black stars had moved into the major leagues or into the minor league system. There was no replenishing system, so the leagues then dissolved. So there's no question that Jackie's breaking of the color barrier certainly signaled the death knell of the Negro Leagues. Yeah.
Alec, did you have something? No. Well, what's that? Well, we want to thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I hope, not only when we're talking about sports and baseball, if you notice, there was so many things intertwined in what happened. And that makes it really important. But I have not had the opportunity to go
Come see me.
to the museum, but
Come
I
see me.
will come.
And I encourage
And
all
now
of
I
you.
sort of know what to look for. But more importantly, whether it stopped operations, what I believe the museum is doing is keeping it alive.
No question.
So that we know who those players are. We know the history, what they were doing. And what you mentioned doing dinner about the organization you're starting, not only for baseball, but you're going to make sure that the other sports are being recognized so that you can pull in all of the other young people in the process. So that really baseball lives. And those people who were not fully recognized can now be even more so at a time when we need heroes.
We do need them, and our young people need them. And in closing, as I so oftentimes share with our visitors when they complete the tour of the museum, and I think it's so invaluable to our young people in particular who are being introduced to a segregated society for the first time. And children summarize segregation quite simple. That was dumb. And they're right, it was dumb. We can learn so much from our children. We always are trying to tell our children what to do, but we can learn a lot from our children. But what the Negro Leagues teaches us, I think, is quite simple. In this great country of ours, if you dare to dream and you believe in yourself, then you can do and be anything you want to be. You see, these great athletes dared to dream of playing baseball. They had no idea that they were making history. They didn't care about making history. They just wanted to play ball. But the passion, the perseverance, the determination, the courage that they demonstrated in the face of adversity. You see, our story is not about the adversity, but rather what they did to overcome the adversity. That's the real story. And that's a story, folks, that transcends race, it transcends age, and it transcends gender. And that is a story that our children richly deserve to be exposed to as they go out and try to deal with some of the things that they're going to be faced with as they venture out into the world.
Again,
Thank you.
thank our guests. All right. Thank you so much. I don't have my folder, but I think I have it memorized. Please remember Richard Norton Smith is back next week, and I think it's March 12th and March 14th. So we hope to see you then. And thank you so very much for coming out this evening.